And now, for a tale from our travels that particularly tickled our sense of the absurd, Chapter 8, or as we call it, Forecast Fells Fortunes. Just as we were surveying ancient history and greeting odd sea life like the mola, an ill wind blew our grand Sintra plans away, redirecting us toward, well, let's just say dinner involved a bell. Let's just say things got interesting. Boarding bumps, boundless blue below. The next leg of our grand tour wasn't exactly scaling mountains or wrestling bears. Mostly it involved getting from point A to point B to see some fish, a plan complicated only by the modern miracle of air travel. We dutifully arrived at the airport, presented ourselves at the counter, and watched as technology promptly decided our tickets were figments of our imagination. The reservation, you see, was perfectly visible on the airline's screen. The actual tickets needed to board, gone, vanished into the digital ether. After a brief, slightly panicked negotiation involving much frowning at screens and concerned keyboard tapping, the airline staff located the errant e-tickets, confirming we were, in fact, allowed on their aeroplane. Progress. Naturally, this minor victory was immediately followed by a delay. Punctuality in Portugal, I'm learning, is less a rigid schedule and more a gentle suggestion, perhaps a national hobby centered around testing the limits of tourist patience. Eventually summoned, we shuffled aboard and discovered a peculiar sight. We were the sole occupants of business class. Now, European business class often means economy seat with the thrilling addition of an empty middle seat, a sort of minimalist nod towards luxury. Our section had 18 such seats, all resolutely empty except for ours. It felt less like an upgrade and more like we'd accidentally wandered into a forgotten annex of the plane. Seizing the moment, I turned to the flight attendant. "I simply cannot abide sitting next to these ruffians," I declared, gesturing at my companions. She smiled and waved me towards another row. My brief moment of splendid isolation lasted about 90 seconds. A woman seated nearby, my wife, traveling with a small child, my son, apparently saw our sparsely populated utopia and decided it looked far more appealing than her assigned spot. She promptly relocated herself and her belongings right next to me. So much for solitude. Her son, demonstrating superior strategic thinking, claimed an entire row for himself by a window, constructing his own little kingdom. The plane lumbered into the sky, and soon we were cruising over the Azores again. This time the daylight revealed what we'd missed before. Sheer cliffs dove straight into the blue Atlantic. A tiny village clung precariously to the rock face, looking like it might sneeze and tumble into the sea. Small houses dotted the coastline, each one a tiny, hopeful barnacle clinging to the rock. It was the kind of view that inspires dramatic thoughts about trading your mortgage for a fishing net and a life of quiet contemplation, at least until you remember you get seasick. Back in our not-quite-private cabin, the meal service commenced. Being the only 3 people in the section meant we were the sole recipients of the food trolley's attention. The flight attendants fussed over us with the kind of focused service usually reserved for minor potentates or lottery winners. It felt remarkably like flying on a private jet, provided you ignored the other 100 or so people sitting behind the curtain. We dined like kings on a surprisingly empty bus route through the sky, the most exclusive widely available flight I'd ever taken. Primeval Portugal, footprints from the forgotten past. Descending into Lisbon felt like waking from a strange dream, the one where you inexplicably find yourselves the sole occupants of business class, only to have your fleeting victory over seating arrangements scuppered by a migrating mother and child. Below us, through a morning mist clinging to the hills like damp laundry, lay Portugal. And not just any Portugal, but land that's apparently seen 400,000 years of continuous human occupation, though you wouldn't guess it just by glancing out the plane window. It just looked like hills. The story allegedly starts way back, around 400,000 years ago, with characters called Homo heidelbergensis. These weren't exactly US, more like our heavily browed, burly cousins who wandered the Iberian Peninsula armed with stone tools. They lived a hunter-gatherer life so tough it would make modern reality show contestants curl up in a fetal position. Archaeologists near Lisbon found bits of them, fossils that reshuffled the deck on early human distribution in Europe. I picture them looking at us now, scratching their prominent brows. 400,000 years, one might grunt to another, gesturing vaguely at a passing airplane. And they came up with this? Where's the sensible rock? Things got a bit more artistically ambitious around 35,000 BCE when folks like us, Homo sapiens, showed up. Their masterpiece is the Coa Valley, basically an open-air gallery where somebody carved thousands of pictures of horses, ancient cattle and ibex onto rocks. They were surprisingly good, like prehistoric paparazzi capturing the local fauna. When scientists stumbled upon this in the 1990s, right where a new dam was planned, it kicked off a huge fuss. In a move that defies modern cynicism, the government actually cancelled the dam. It might be the only recorded instance of graffiti saving a river, though I suspect some of it was just youngsters trying to annoy their elders. Ugg says Ogg's mammoth drawing is rubbish. Classic teenage rebellion. Then came the Neolithic period, roughly 5,000 to 3,000 BCE. People graduated from drawing on rocks to dragging massive ones across the landscape. Megalithic monuments popped up everywhere. Dolmens, passage graves, stone circles. It must have taken incredible teamwork, or possibly just one really persuasive guy with a loud voice. Near Evora, the Almendres Cromlech boasts about 100 standing stones arranged with what looks like serious astronomical know-how. Building this complex calendar required more cosmic geometry than figuring out how to assemble flat-pack furniture, though presumably with fewer leftover parts. By the Bronze Age, 1800 to 800 BCE, society got organized enough to build fortified hilltop settlements called castros. Think of them as the original gated communities, complete with walls and prime views, but swap the golf carts for chariots and the homeowners' association disputes for spear-chucking contests. They traded metals with folks sailing around the Mediterranean and started forming hierarchies, presumably arguing over who had the biggest fort. The final act before the Romans crashed the party began around 800 BCE with the arrival of Celtic tribes. They mingled with the locals, creating the Lusitanian culture. These guys brought iron, fancier pottery, and a general unwillingness to be conquered. They became known as fierce warriors using sneaky guerrilla tactics and distinctive curved daggers, giving the famously organized Roman legions quite a headache. You can almost hear a centurion complaining, "They just don't fight fair." At the Castro de São Lourenço near Esposende, you can see reconstructions of their round stone houses with thatched roofs. It gives you a feel for pre-Roman life. Communal granaries for storing food, shrines for gods nobody remembers now, and sturdy walls for keeping uninvited Romans out. It shows a society ready for anything, from feasts to famine, parties to parrying invaders. Looking out from these ancient hills, you feel the immense weight of time, layer upon layer of human striving stacked up like sedimentary rock. Phoenicians to Pax Romana, Portugal's ancient Mediterranean makeover. That morning mist I saw clinging to the hills on approach had apparently decided to follow us inside, specifically into the vast, echoing terminal of Lisbon Airport. Having survived the descent through 400,000 years of potential history, The immediate challenge was the seemingly endless walk from our gate. It felt less like arriving and more like the Bataan Death March, but with rolling luggage and considerably less historical significance. Finally emerging into the actual country of Portugal, we found a hopeful sight, a neat line of modern taxis. Progress. Except none accepted credit cards. A truly baffling feature of modern European life, like finding out smartphones only work if you crank a handle on the side. We eventually flagged down a driver whose car looked slightly less regulation and whose willingness to accept crumpled euros felt like a minor miracle. Our driver was a character, bursting with opinions he was eager to share. He pointed out a Zara, noting with profound confidence that all women love Zara. A sweeping generalization I didn't dare question. His insights took a darker, more confusing turn when a car with Ukrainian plates passed. He launched into an enthusiastic pantomime of firing a machine gun, presumably offering commentary on the war, though the exact message was lost in translation and slightly alarming hand gestures. It was an abrupt shift from fast fashion to geopolitics that left us mostly nodding and hoping he'd focus on the road. For about $25, he deposited us, slightly dazed, at our hotel. The hotel was pleasant enough, but its crown jewel, the true sign we had arrived in civilization, was the washing machine tucked away in the apartment. Priorities firmly established. Getting acquainted with its mysterious European settings became job one. Forget ancient ruins for a moment. The immediate conquest involved mastering the delicate art of the Portuguese spin cycle. That sorted. The fish expedition could wait. First, though, came the view. Our window looked out towards the Tagus River. The sun, making a brief cameo, glinted off the water. I squinted, trying to erase the container ships and imagine some hardy Phoenician sailor, maybe around 1200 BCE, laying eyes on this wide natural harbor and thinking, jackpot, good spot for a warehouse. These folks from ancient Lebanon called it Alice Ubo, safe harbor. A name that must have seemed bitterly ironic about 3 millennia later, when an earthquake and tsunami rearranged the local geography quite drastically. The Phoenicians were basically the go-getters of the ancient Mediterranean, setting up shop along Portugal's coast between 900 and 600 BCE. They weren't looking to plant flags so much as trade goods, fancy beads, ivory doodads, pottery, the kind of stuff you can still see at the archaeology museum if you're into that sort of thing. They also brought the alphabet and better boat designs, according to Dr. Sofia Mendes, an archaeologist I chatted with at the museum. The Phoenicians weren't colonizers in the traditional sense. They were primarily interested in resources, especially metals like copper, tin, and silver from the interior. They built coastal factories, not forts, and seemed content with making deals rather than enemies. A novel concept. The Greeks popped by later, though seemingly more for sightseeing and selling their own pottery than settling down. They left behind coins and stories, including one about Hercules wrestling a monster out here at the edge of the world, a nice, relatively calm period of swapping goods and myths, until 218 BCE. That's when Rome decided the Mediterranean needed a change in management, specifically their management. The Romans initially saw Iberia as a convenient back route to fight Carthage, but like anyone who discovers a good shortcut, they decided to just take over the whole street. Olisipo, the local name for Lisbon, fell by 205 BCE. Its harbour was too good to pass up. Roman legions marched inland, applying their standard pacification program, which, as Emperor Augustus later implied, mostly involved eliminating loud opposition. By 139 BCE, most of modern Portugal was playing by Roman rules. You get a real feel for Roman Portugal visiting the ruins of Coimbriga, near Coimbra. They had fancy houses with elaborate floor mosaics, public baths, aqueducts, the works. One rich guy built a house with 500 water jets squirting in patterns, the ancient equivalent of a laser light show crossed with a gaudy McMansion fountain. Roman engineering was so advanced that some of their structures have outlasted buildings constructed just a century ago. Their concrete formula included volcanic ash that actually strengthens over time underwater. Good stuff. Makes you wonder why my hometown fills the same potholes year after year. Rome built roads, cities like Bracara Augusta, Braga up north, and turned Olisipo into a major port. They brought Latin, which eventually morphed into Portuguese, their laws, and, crucially, expanded olive oil production and winemaking. Yes, the Romans basically introduced large-scale vino cultivation. Depending on your outlook, this might be their single most important contribution to Portuguese culture, standing in the ruins of the Roman theatre back in Lisbon. It's hard not to be impressed. Phoenicians looking for metals, Greeks telling tall tales, Romans building everything from aqueducts to wineries. They all sailed into this safe harbor and left their mark. They came, they traded, they conquered, and they left behind the ingredients for a nation: wine, words, and roads. Not a bad legacy, really. But after contemplating millennia of history, you still have to wonder, did any of those Romans ever figure out how the washing machine worked? Iberia's awkward adolescence, when Romans left and Germans moved in. We've seen the handiwork of the Romans in Portugal, the roads still underpinning modern highways, the fancy plumbing in Coimbriga that made my own bathroom look primitive, the grand theatre in Lisbon. We'd marveled at their efficiency, their engineering, their knack for leaving impressive ruins basically everywhere. But empires, like old boxers, eventually start looking unsteady on their feet. And by the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire wasn't just wobbling. It was practically leaning on the ropes, waiting for the bell. In Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula they'd run for ages, the retirement party was clearly overdue. Rome's grip was slipping. The legions were stretched thin. The bureaucrats were probably drowning in triplicate forms about declining grain shipments, and headquarters back in Italy had frankly bigger problems, like people banging on their actual front door. This kind of imperial distraction is basically an open invitation for anyone with a horse and a sharp piece of metal to come exploring. And explore they did. In 409, a grab bag of Germanic groups, Suebi, Vandals, plus their Allan associates, decided the Iberian Peninsula looked like a promising fixer-upper. They swarmed over the Pyrenees, less like invited guests and more like fans, storming the field after a championship win, only with more looting and less celebratory Gatorade dumping. The remaining Romans, presumably peered over their fortifications, grumbled about the neighborhood going downhill, and ordered another round of wine. Now, you might picture these tribes sticking together like fraternity brothers on spring break, but not quite. The Vandals, after kicking up some dust and seeing one of their branches, the Silingi, get smacked down by the later arriving Visigoths working as Roman bouncers, decided North Africa was the real prize. Under their enterprising leader Genseric, they booked passage across the Strait of Gibraltar in 429, leaving Iberia to sort itself out. The Alans mostly got absorbed into other groups, but the Suebi, they liked the place. They carved out a little kingdom for themselves up in the northwest, in what the Romans called Galliacia, basically modern Galicia and northern Portugal. They even picked Bracara Augusta, today's Braga, as their capital. Give them credit. This was likely the first independent Germanic kingdom set up on Roman turf. Trendsetters, these Suebi. History tends to focus on the bigger names, but the Suebi got there first. They also apparently rocked a rather complex hairstyle called the Swebian knot, which sounds like something best attempted by a professional stylist and probably awkward under a helmet. For about 170 years, the Suebi did their thing. They started out pagan, but like many newcomers settling into an established neighborhood, they eventually converted to Christianity and probably adopted quite a few local Hispano-Roman customs. Instead of just burning villas, they started living in them, which is progress of a sort. But their relatively quiet corner wasn't safe forever. Enter the Visigoths, the headliners of this particular historical concert. The Visigoths had also wandered into Iberia, initially on the Roman payroll as foederati, the fancy term for hired muscle tasked with cleaning up the mess left by the 409 crowd. But once the Western Roman Empire officially threw in the towel in 476, the Visigoths looked around, surveyed the property, and decided they rather liked it. Having lost most of their territory in Gaul to the Franks, they shifted their main operations south of the Pyrenees, setting up shop in Toledo. They went from contractors to the new management. Compared to the Suebi tucked away in their corner, the Visigoths had ambitions encompassing the whole peninsula. It took a couple of centuries, but under determined kings like Leovigild in the late 500s, they finally managed it. Around 585, Leovigild conquered the Suebi kingdom, bringing Galatia into the Visigothic fold. He also tried to get everyone on the same religious page with Arian Christianity, a version the mainstream Nicene Catholics considered off-brand, but it caused more friction than unity. Now, you might think trying to force a religious issue on a population that mostly disagreed was a bad move. You'd be right. His son, Record, proved cannier. Around 589, he smartly switched the kingdom over to Catholicism, which smoothed things over considerably with the majority Hispano-Roman population. The Visigoths issued laws, tried to act all Roman and authoritative, but their history reads like a political thriller. Constant infighting and kings finding out that wearing the crown was often hazardous to their long-term health. So by the time the 700s rolled around, the Visigothic kingdom seemed like the established power in Iberia. They'd unified the territory, mostly. They'd settled the religious arguments, mostly. They were governing, issuing decrees, and generally looking like they were there to stay. But history rarely lets things settle comfortably. Their kingdom, seemingly solid, stood on ground that felt stable but perhaps wasn't. You could almost feel a change in the wind blowing up from the south. Dominion divided, Moorish makeover, monarch's might. So, the Visigoths had sorted Iberia, unified the place under one banner and one church, and were busy acting like proper Roman successors in Toledo. Solid foundation, right? What could possibly go wrong next? Well, in 711, someone neglected to lock the back door. Armies from North Africa, collectively known as the Moors, zipped across the Strait of Gibraltar. They found the Visigothic kingdom less a formidable fortress and more like a poorly managed stage production, ripe for a hostile takeover. Lisbon, or Olisipo as the Romans and Goths knew it, fell quickly. The new management promptly slapped a new sign on the door, Al-Ushbuna. Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it? Almost sounds like a sneeze. These weren't just conquerors. They were improvers, administrators with a flair for engineering. They brought sophisticated irrigation, turning dry plots into productive land. Imagine the local farmers suddenly seeing water appear as if by magic, or at least clever hydraulics. They introduced new crops, architectural styles that favored courtyards and intricate details, and fostered a period of learning and cultural mingling. For over 400 years, Al-Ushbuna flourished under Moorish rule, a significant city in the western reaches of the Islamic world known as Al-Andalus. Life settled into a new rhythm, layered over the Roman and Visigothic foundations. But history has a habit of repeating its eviction notices. Down south, a new power was rising. A local nobleman, Dom Afonso Henriquez, harbored ambitions. He wasn't content being a count. He eyed a crown. Around 1147, Afonso made a rather significant decision. Seeing his chance during the commotion of the Second Crusade, because nothing says opportunity knocks like thousands of armed European knights sailing past your coast on their way to the Holy Land, he besieged Lisbon. With a helpful, if likely messy, assist from these crusaders who diverted briefly for some Iberian campaigning, Afonso captured the city. Al-Ushbuna became Lisbon again. 4 centuries of Moorish presence didn't just vanish, of course. You can still feel echoes of it in the Alfama district's winding streets. But the management had changed hands once more. Afonso Henriquez wasn't just a conqueror. He was now the first king of Portugal. The city, battered but retaken, became his capital. Apparently, taking Lisbon is good for one's resume. Dominions dawn, discoveries, defining Portugal's domain. Peering down from the airplane window, the Azores looked like emerald confetti tossed onto the vast blue floor of the Atlantic. Charming specks of green volcanic enthusiasm, certainly easier to spot from 30,000 feet than it must have been back in the 15th century. Think about it. After Portugal finally showed the Moors the door in Lisbon, settling down to alphabetize the royal sock drawer apparently lacked a certain zing. Conquering Ceuta in North Africa in 1415 was their way of saying, "We're expanding the portfolio," a clear signal that mainland chores were off the table. Next up, island shopping in the Atlantic. Around 1427, somebody named Diogo de Silves might have glimpsed Santa Maria and São Miguel. Perhaps he noted them down as potential spots to top up the, well, whatever ships needed topping up with back then. It wasn't until 1432 that Gonçalo Velho Cabral actually hopped ashore on Santa Maria, stuck a flag in it, and officially claimed it for the crown. Then, almost suspiciously quickly, all 9 islands were sketched onto maps by 1439. Settlers trickled in from Portugal, Flanders, even Madeira, likely lured by promises of land, very probably there, definitely watery. They eventually started building a fort, São Brás, in Ponta Delgada, but really buckled down around 1552. Seems you couldn't rush quality rampart construction. While the Azorians were busy learning how to farm volcanic soil and possibly dodging early pirates, the folks back in Lisbon were fully committed to this finding new places business. Diogo Cao sailed down to the Congo River in 1482, went home, came back in 1486, and then vanished from the logbooks, which usually isn't a great sign for a sailor. Bartolomeu Dias followed, managing a harrowing trip around the tip of Africa in 1488. He called it the Cape of Good Hope, a name dripping with either optimism or profound relief after nearly being swallowed by the sea. Vasco da Gama, the bona fide exploring superstar, finally punched through to India between 1497 and 1499, hitting the spice jackpot. He landed in Calicut in 1498, probably demanding where the pepper was kept. His return trip in 1502 involved less asking and more artillery-based negotiation. This whole period seemed cursed with accidental geography. Pedro Álvares Cabral, aiming for India in 1500, sort of tripped over Brazil. The report back must have been awkward. "Sire, great news. We found a massive continent nobody knew about. Bad news, still working on that direct pepper delivery." It felt less like methodical exploration and more like a global shopping spree fueled by codfish and nerve. Did these navigators even sleep? Portugal grabbed Goa in 1510, Malacca in 1511 to control the spice lanes, and had Jorge Alvarez poking around southern China by 1513. It was like watching someone compulsively clicking Add to Cart on the world map. Back in the relative quiet of the Azores, São Miguel received a violent geological reminder in 1522. A massive earthquake essentially deleted the capital, Vila Franca do Campo, promoting Ponta Delgada to main town status practically overnight. This earthly tantrum also kicked off the Romero's pilgrimages, where locals take very long walks around the island praying, possibly for sturdier real estate. Meanwhile, the Portuguese diaspora continued. João Rodrigues Cabrillo, sailing for Spain because explorers were apparently interchangeable, gave California its first European glance in 1542. Another Portuguese ship introduced Japan to the noisy end of a musket in 1543, a technological gift received with mixed enthusiasm. St. Francis Xavier arrived in 1549 to spread the gospel, and by 1557, Portugal sweet-talked the Ming dynasty into letting them set up shop in Macau. A tiny nation, starting by consolidating its own borders, ended up playing connect the dots across the entire planet in just over a century. Quite the pivot from tidying up the kingdom to circling the globe. The king who ghosted a nation, Sebastião, the Sultan slayer who never was. Having watched Portugal rack up global real estate faster than anyone could draw the maps, Africa, Azores, India, Brazil, even accidental pit stops in China and Japan, you might assume they'd finally mastered the art of not tripping over their own feet on the world stage. That assumption, like many involving European monarchies, would be spectacularly wrong. Because just as things were hitting their stride, Portugal decided it was time for an interesting plot twist, starring a teenager who seemed convinced he was auditioning for the role of God's favorite action hero. Enter King Sebastião. Born in 1554. After his father had already checked out, he became king at the ripe old age of 3. A challenging age for anyone, let alone someone tasked with running a burgeoning empire when he likely hadn't yet mastered solid foods. Raised by Jesuits whose piety was apparently measured in kilograms, young Sebastião grew up convinced he was destined for greatness, preferably involving swords and heathens. Think of him as the ultimate Habsburg product, possibly bred more for jawline than judgment, and filled with the divine certainty only available to the truly inexperienced. By 19, an age when today's youth are mastering TikTok dances, but back then apparently qualified you for crusade leadership, Sebastião had his eye on North Africa. Not for sensible reasons like trade routes or diplomatic smoozing, mind you. No, he aimed to restart the Crusades because clearly the late 16th century was crying out for another round of Europeans marching into deserts shouting religious slogans. One has to wonder, did anyone suggest maybe starting with something smaller, like conquering a moderately difficult board game first? The resulting Battle of Alcázar Quibir in 1578 wasn't just a loss. It was a cinematic faceplant. The Portuguese army, heavy on aristocratic swagger and light on workable battle plans, got thoroughly trounced by Sultan Abd al-Malik's forces. King Sebastião, reportedly sporting a helmet too heavy for his regal neck and stubbornly refusing the traditionally sensible option of retreating when things go pear-shaped, was last spotted amongst the general carnage. Then, poof, he vanished into the Moroccan dust. His body was never found, or at least never convincingly labelled Sebastião. Portugal did not take this well. Instead of collective grief, or perhaps a national inquiry into military incompetence, the country opted for Plan B, widespread delusion. Sebastião wasn't dead, you see. He was merely elsewhere, hiding on a secret island, perhaps contemplating his life choices with some monks, or maybe he'd achieved a state of foggy transcendence. This fervent belief, known as Sebastianism, wasn't just a quirky coping mechanism. It became a national waiting game lasting centuries. 4 different guys even tried claiming they were the returned Sebastio before being variously imprisoned, executed, or told to knock it off. The myth plugged a hole larger than the one Sebastio left on the battlefield. His vanishing act led directly to 60 years of Spanish rule under the Iberian Union, a Habsburg family reunion nobody in Portugal had asked for. Sebastio morphed into a symbol of lost independence, of righteous hope, maybe even of divine intervention taking an extended coffee break. People genuinely believed he'd eventually stride out of the mist, sword gleaming, ready to make Portugal great again, presumably having kept up with current events via spectral telegram. This belief proved remarkably stubborn, surviving wars, the Enlightenment, and even the invention of sensible raincoats. By the 19th century, poets like Fernando Pessoa were treating Sebastio less like a historical figure and more like a symbolic superhero waiting for his cue. Even Antonio Salazar, Portugal's 20th century dictator, played footsai with the myth, casting himself as the strongman holding down the fort until the real king showed up. It's the political equivalent of keeping your ex's sweater, just in case. It's easy to see the appeal. When everything's collapsing, your empire, your economy, your dynasty, believing a hero will magically return is much cozier than facing the messy reality of rebuilding. Sebastio became Portugal's own Schrödinger's cat, simultaneously vanished and potentially around the next corner, a ghost woven into the nation's fabric. Every country tucks away such myths, but Portugal clung to theirs with a unique, poignant tenacity. The desert took the young king, but the story kept him alive, echoing faintly perhaps, like the wind across those Moroccan plains where a kingdom's confidence turned to dust. Sovereign struggle, Spain, separation, and shocks. So, about that missing king situation. Turns out, when your monarch vanishes in a puff of desert sand and misplaced piety, as young Sebastio did, things tend to go sideways. Fast. After tracking Portugal's knack for planting flags on seemingly every beach with a decent view, you have to ask, what's the follow-up act to accidentally discovering Brazil? Apparently, it's falling flat on your national face. The trouble brewed, as big national headaches often do, over picking a successor in 1580. With Sebastio gone AWOL in North Africa and leaving no spare heirs, Spain's King Philip II saw a job opening. He politely elbowed his way onto the Portuguese throne, launching the 60-year Iberian Union. This sounds like a friendly neighborhood merger, but mostly meant Portugal suddenly had management in Madrid. For the next 6 decades, Portugal, now officially Spain adjacent, watched its hard-won empire get carved up like a free sample platter. The Dutch and English, smelling blood in the water and probably nutmeg, decided Portuguese claims were less ownership deeds and more strongly worded suggestions. Northeastern Brazil? The Dutch borrowed it for a couple of decades. Luanda in Angola. Say, Army deal, shorter lease, Ceylon and bits of India. Consider them repossessed by competitors who didn't have to check with Madrid first. Even Japan, once receptive to Portuguese traders and their explosive gadgets, slammed the door shut in 1639, specifically telling Portuguese ships not to bother knocking again. Back on São Miguel Island in the Azores, which we'd peacefully flown over on our way here, the Furnace volcano staged a major eruption in 1630, adding a layer of volcanic ash to the imperial insult. You can almost picture the locals sighing, could this century possibly throw anything else at us? Finally, in 1640, the Portuguese decided 60 years of Spanish oversight was plenty, thank you very much. They kicked the Spanish out and grabbed their independence back. Hooray! Now about those bills. Freedom isn't free, especially when your empire's been pilfered. The solution came in 1703 with the Methuen Treaty, struck with England. Basically, Portugal agreed to crank out port wine, which the English gentry developed quite a taste for. In return, England supplied textiles which presumably kept the Portuguese from freezing. It was an alliance forged in alcohol and sturdy fabrics, locking Portugal's economy into Britain's coat-tails, just as Britain was becoming the global equivalent of the House PA system, suddenly everywhere and influencing everything. Spain eventually, officially, recognized Portugal's independence in 1668, probably with a resigned shrug. Things appeared to settle into this new arrangement. Portugal, the former explorer giant, now focused on vineyards and trying not to annoy its very large neighbor. Then came November 1st, 1755, All Saints' Day. While Lisbon attended morning mass, the ground started doing the cha-cha, violently. A monstrous earthquake, maybe a magnitude 9, shook the capital into splinters. As if that wasn't bad enough, the Tagus River surged inland as a tsunami, and fires broke out everywhere. It was demolition on a biblical scale, nature's way of hitting the reset button violently after centuries of ambition and recent decline. Standing here now, looking at the rebuilt city squares, it's hard not to think about bouncing back. Maybe finding a glass of that very treaty-mandated port is the best way to contemplate a city built, destroyed, and built again. Yes, that feels right. A measure of resilience against the ruins of history. Queen Maria fine and Dom Juan VI. Madness, monarchy, and a kingdom on the run. So Portugal had weathered earthquakes that rearranged Lisbon like a toddler's block collection, signed treaties that felt less like alliances and more like IOUs to England, and even managed to get itself barred from Japan. What dizzying turn could this national story take next? How about a royal family drama that makes daytime television look tame, staged mostly on the high seas and featuring a pious queen losing her marbles and a prince whose defining trait was apparently extreme nervousness? Enter Queen Maria the Fair, crowned in 1777. She was Portugal's first solo queen regnant, deeply religious. They called her the Pious, and started strong, kicking out her dad's heavy-handed prime minister, the Marquis of Pombal. A promising start, suggesting a less iron-fisted era. But fate, or perhaps some dodgy royal genetics, had other ideas. Between 1786 and 1792, her world crumbled like a stale pastry. Her husband died, her eldest son, the heir, died, her confessor died, and just for good measure, the French Revolution kicked off across the border, sending shivers down every monarch's spine and adding existential dread regarding guillotines to Maria's already full plate of anxieties. By 1792, the piety had curdled into something else entirely. Plagued by religious mania and bouts of intense sobbing, poor Maria was declared unfit to rule. In Brazil, they'd later drop the pious moniker for the more direct Maria the Mad. Her surviving son, João, stepped up as Prince Regent, essentially taking the wheel while Mom was indisposed. Now, João wasn't exactly carved from hero stone. He was famously cautious, maddeningly indecisive, and prone to dithering. Detractors, like a certain Thomas Jefferson over in America, apparently viewed him as lacking courage. Satirists had a field day, drawing him less like a king and more like a mid-level manager perpetually worried about filing deadlines. William Beckford, an English visitor sniffing around the Portuguese court during these years, noted the atmosphere wasn't exactly chipper. Describing the general vibe, he wrote of a court wrapped in anticipations of vespers and anxieties about salvation. Cheerful stuff. It paints a picture of a court tiptoeing around a grieving, unstable queen and led by a prince who probably checked under his bed for assassins nightly. Yet, when genuine crisis arrived in 1807 wearing a French uniform, specifically Napoleon's armies marching on Lisbon, this hesitant prince did something utterly bonkers. He ran away. Not just him, mind you. He packed up the entire royal court, lock, stock, and powdered wig barrel onto a fleet of leaky ships and sailed them clear across the Atlantic to Brazil. Imagine the packing list. It was the first and likely only time a European empire just picked up its capital and plonked it down in a colony. Rio de Janeiro suddenly became the headquarters, complete with confused Portuguese nobles sweating through their finest silks in tropical humidity. While Napoleon's troops were busy pilfering Lisbon, João, safe in sunny Brazil, was setting up a government in exile, opening Brazilian ports to trade, a big deal, and inadvertently turning a colonial backwater into the temporary nerve center of a global empire. Who's cowardly now, Jefferson? Queen Maria made the trip too, though by then she was mostly a ghost drifting through the palace rooms in Rio, occasionally startling people with loud psalm recitals or echoing sobs. She died there in 1816, the only European monarch ever to expire in the Americas. Her body was eventually shipped back to Lisbon, completing a rather grim round trip. Her death meant João finally got to upgrade his title from Prince Regent to King João VI. He ruled until 1826, overseeing the gradual breaking apart of the empire, including, in a twist of supreme irony, Brazil declaring independence in 1822, led by none other than his own son, Pedro. You just can't make this stuff up. Looking out over the Tagus now, thinking back from the Phoenicians to the Romans to the chaotic shifts of power described in that prior history lesson, it's clear the Braganzas weren't storybook heroes. Maria was a figure of profound sadness, crushed by loss and history. João was the butt of jokes, the ditherer-in-chief. But faced with erasure by Napoleon, they survived. He saved the crown, even if it meant doing it from the other side of the world. Sometimes just managing not to completely fall apart is its own kind of victory, keeping the long, often strange story of human presence on this landscape going. Sintra to succession, strolling through Portugal's tumultuous 19th century. So, after tracing the slightly mad reign of Queen Maria I and her son João VI's transatlantic escape act, I assumed Portuguese history might take a breather, perhaps settle down with a nice cup of tea. Apparently not. While Lord Byron was wandering the hills near Lisbon in 1809, scribbling things like, "Lo!" Sintra's glorious Eden intervenes in variegated maze of mount and glen. The rest of the country was less concerned with poetic shrubbery and more with the fact their king was still ruling from sunny Brazil, courtesy of Napoleon. Byron saw picturesque scenery. Portugal saw a simmering political pot about to boil over. It's quite the paradox, postcard views masking a national nervous breakdown. 11 years after Byron's poetic outburst, things officially went sideways. The 1820 Liberal Revolution kicked off, demanding King João VI return from his extended Rio vacation, where he'd wisely sat out the whole Napoleon business. The revolutionaries wanted him back, but with a constitution firmly attached. João, likely sensing the mood back home had shifted from missing you to get back here or else, packed his bags. He sailed for Lisbon, leaving his son, Pedro, minding the store in Brazil. A decision with all the foresight of handing a lit match to a pyromaniac. Naturally, this long-distance parenting plan imploded. By 1822, Pedro decided Brazil was ready to leave the nest. Standing by the Ipiranga stream, he yelled, "Independence or death." which, considering he was the son of propulsion's king, declaring independence from his own dad, must have made subsequent Father's Day cards incredibly awkward. Things got even more tangled when João VI died in 1826. Pedro briefly became King Pedro IV of Portugal, while still being Emperor Pedro I of Brazil. You have to feel for the poor souls engraving the official letterheads. Deciding that juggling 2 crowns across the Atlantic was likely to cause migraines, Pedro abdicated the Portuguese throne. His brilliant idea? Give it to his 7-year-old daughter, Maria II. But wait, there's more. He arranged for his younger brother, Miguel, to act as regent and marry the young queen when she was older. Miguel, demonstrating a spectacular lack of trustworthiness that should be studied by aspiring villains, promptly seized power in 1828. He declared himself absolute monarch, tossed the constitution Pedro had written, exiled his niece/fiancée, and started cracking down on liberals. It was less a regency, more a hostile takeover, complete with dungeons. This betrayal, predictably, sparked the liberal wars. For 6 years, it was brother against brother, as Pedro gave up his Brazilian throne to come fight Miguel for his daughter's Portuguese one. Imagine Thanksgiving dinner during that period. The war finally ended in 1834, with Miguel defeated and banished, probably told never to babysit again, and 15-year-old Maria II restored to the throne. Portugal officially had its constitutional monarchy, though finding actual political stability proved harder than finding a parking spot in Lisbon during rush hour. While the royals were busy feuding, Portugal's influence abroad was quietly shrinking. The Opium Wars boosted British Hong Kong, making Portuguese Macau look less important. Slowly, the once vast empire started to fray at the edges. Then, in 1859, Portugal and the Netherlands got together for the Treaty of Lisbon. They calmly divided the island of Timor between them, drawing lines on a map in Europe, like they were splitting a desert, neatly deciding the fate of people thousands of miles away. Back home, perhaps seeking a bit of calm amidst the constant political shuffling, they focused on things like building the chapel of Nossa Senhora das Vitórias in Furnas. After decades of revolution, betrayal, and cross-continental sibling rivalry, maybe a quiet chapel felt like a good idea. Looking at the serene landscape now, how did anyone keep track of who was supposed to be ruling whom? Minor mishaps, making moves toward marine life. While Portugal wrestled with 19th-century revolutions and sibling rivalries for the throne, our own pressing concern involved a far more recent, though equally infuriating, breach of justice. Back at the last hotel, a phantom menace had apparently raided our minibar, leaving us accused of consuming 1 beer and some other mystery liquid. The charge was a mere €8, but international law was clearly being flouted. Our appeal is pending. Compounding this injustice is the perplexing local custom of treating us like designated drivers who desperately need conversion therapy. Upon checking into our current lodgings, we were ambushed with a complimentary bottle of red wine and some apples. A nice thought, I suppose, if you actually drink alcohol, which we don't. Our collection of unsolicited booze grows steadily, a liquid monument to good intentions gone slightly wrong. With the great minibar heist investigation temporarily on hold, we turned our attention back to Lisbon. First stop, lunch. Because exploring a city on an empty stomach is a rookie mistake, possibly punishable by finding more unwanted wine in your luggage. We found a place near the river where I ordered shrimp risotto, a dish I approach with the same caution one might reserve for experimental aircraft flown by nervous squirrels. Outside, the weather decided to join the general theme of mild inconvenience, unleashing wind and rain with the enthusiasm of a disgruntled god emptying a celestial bucket. This particular waterfront zone, lashed by rain, is called Parque das Nações, the legacy of Expo 98. The Portuguese hosted a World Expo here, themed The Oceans, a Heritage for the Future, ostensibly celebrating 500 years since Vasco da Gama went sailing and accidentally kicked off a global empire. They cleared out old factories and turned the area into a shiny modern district. Is an ocean heritage or future? Seems like picking one would be less confusing. Anyway, the place now boasts one of Europe's biggest aquariums, the Oceanário, a train station that looks like Santiago Calatrava designed it after dreaming of a giant metallic insect, Gara do Oriente, a bridge long enough to make you forget what country you started in, an arena, a mall and a cable car for dangling precariously over the river. A fine example of urban renewal, I'm told, though currently it mostly looked wet. The restaurant itself was a peculiar circular structure. Inspiration, possibly fueled by low blood sugar and the damp, struck me. This, I announced gravely to wife and son, pointing with my fork, was the American Pavilion. Originally, it was the torch from the Statue of Liberty. For about 3 glorious seconds they bought it. Sometimes my genius is almost frightening. Any sense of quiet contemplation, however, was shattered by the arrival of what seemed like the entire cast of an Italian high school drama production. A large, boisterous group of teenagers descended upon the restaurant, instantly transforming the atmosphere from vaguely damp seafood joint to something resembling a particle accelerator filled with espresso and hormones. Lunch became less about the surprisingly decent risotto and more about navigating the sonic booms and enthusiastic gesturing ricocheting off the circular walls. It was loud, it was chaotic, it was aggressively Italian. Sunfish, sushi and sudden schedule shifts in Lisbon. Having definitively concluded that the circular restaurant was merely a restaurant and not, as I'd brilliantly suggested, the misplaced torch of the Statue of Liberty, we left the echoes of enthusiastic Italian teenagers behind. The phantom €8 beer charge from the last hotel still tickled the back of my mind, a tiny, unsolved mystery in our growing collection of Lisbon quirks. Right next to the pile of complimentary but unwanted alcohol. Still, we pressed on toward the former expo grounds, drawn by the promise of fish. Our first glimpse of the area included a poignant reminder of Expo 98 itself, some sort of mascot, bobbing listlessly in the river nearby. It was tethered permanently, looking like a cartoon character who'd missed the memo about retirement and was now just floating. A slightly damp monument to the oceans, a heritage for the future, which was the Expo's remarkably optimistic theme. The main event, the old Ocean Pavilion, had wisely rebranded itself as the Oceanário de Lisboa, or Lisbon Oceanarium. Inside, the charm offensive started immediately with a platoon of tiny, unreasonably cute birds. It felt suspicious, like a fluffy distraction deployed before they brought out the truly weird stuff, and indeed they did. We rounded a corner and came face to fin with a mola, the ocean sunfish. It looked like a colossal severed head with fins someone had glued on as an afterthought. I had a distinct sensation of never having seen such a creature before. Then, a faint glimmer stirred in the jet-lagged fog of my memory. Osaka. I had seen one before. The brain is a peculiar filing cabinet, often misplacing important documents while keeping duplicates of things like giant, swimming dinner plates. My son, whose taste runs towards the peculiar and the serpentine, was predictably thrilled by the eels. Possibly because they look like something that might grant sinister wishes in a fairy tale. Elsewhere, the aquarium offered a nod to Portugal's famous azulejo tiles, but with a modern twist. They were pixelated. Because when you want to honor intricate, centuries-old ceramic art, the obvious route is to make it look like an artifact from an Atari 2600. Progress, I suppose. With our tour of aquatic wonders complete, the primal urge for sustenance took over. We gravitated towards a nearby shopping mall, the universal symbol of giving up on finding authentic local character for the evening. Nothing screams cultural immersion like the gentle glow of a food court sparrow. We opted for sushi because viewing hundreds of swimming fish naturally inspires a craving for their raw, sliced brethren. But the evening's true revelation awaited us, the gleaming, unmistakable beacon of Taco Bell. It felt less like a discovery and more like stumbling upon a misplaced piece of American folklore. Naturally, embracing the spirit of international relations and processed cheese, we sampled the Chocodilla Kit Kat. Surprisingly good, though the flour tortilla felt like it was missing a little something, perhaps dignity. Hard to say. Back at the hotel, smugly digesting our international fast food bounty, we encountered a new wrinkle in our meticulously crafted plans. An email informed us that our tickets for Sintra tomorrow were now decorative hyperlinks. The site was closed due to rain. Apparently, Sintra had been closed today due to rain. And, the message implied with ominous certainty, Sintra stood a decent chance of being closed on Friday due to rain. Our carefully laid plans dissolved like a sugar cube in the downpour. Lisbon, however, is not a city short on distractions. We would have to adjust. We would find something else to do. Lisbon, it seemed, still had plenty to offer, assuming it didn't involve hillside palaces prone to dampness. So ends Chapter 8, where Forecast Fell's fortunes demonstrated that travel plans are sometimes as dependable as the outlooks that overturn them, compelling a redirection much like Portugal's own historical shifts. With attention now firmly on Lisbon, how will confronting the city's heralded age of discovery alongside its profound shocks alter our view of endurance? Stay tuned for the next chapter of The Rise the Limit.